Well, tonight we are continuing our study on Hebrews called Jesus, the Mediator of a New and Better Covenant or a New and Better Testament. And this is teaching number 6. It's part 1. We're not going to get all the way through the notes that you have before you. So we'll get about a third of the way through and we'll finish next week in part 2. But this is teaching number 6, part 1, resisting the pressure to reject Jesus and the New Testament of grace. We're continuing our study in Hebrews 3, 1 through 4:11, and we began last week with Hebrews 3, 1 through 6, which reads, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all of God's house. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all of God's house, bearing witness to what would be spoken by God in the future. But Christ is faithful as the Son over God's house, and we are his house, if indeed we hold firmly to our confidence and the hope which we glory." So we started our study last week in Hebrews 3:1, which says, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and our high priest." So I would encourage anyone who's possibly listening on a podcast or watching a video to go back and maybe catch up to this teaching, because all the teachings build upon each other. And I go last week pretty in depth into Hebrews 3:1, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling," really go in depth into understanding those verses. Now, one of the keys to understanding Hebrews, we've talked some about the historical situation that the Hebrews, the Jewish people, were facing when the book was written. This letter of Hebrews was written in AD 65. And tonight, I want us to go a little bit more in depth in the book of Hebrews, and we're going to see what this struggle was that they were having, what these battles were that they were facing, the persecution they were facing, if they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, if they believed that Jesus established the new covenant in his blood. So we've got to understand the situation in AD 65 if we're going to understand Hebrews 3, 1 through 6, as well as all of Hebrews. So the situation in AD 65 is the Jewish people are under tremendous pressure to reject Jesus as the Son of God, Hebrews 1, the Son of Man, Hebrews 2, which are Jewish scripture titles of the Messiah, Son of God being 100% God, Son of Man being 100% man. So the Jewish people are under tremendous pressure to reject Jesus as the Son, and they're under tremendous pressure to reject the New Testament of grace that Jesus established in his blood, resulting in remaining or returning to the law of Moses for purification for sins. Now, the pressure they were facing came from two areas. Area number one is they were being persuaded to not believe that Jesus was the Son, to not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ. Area number two they were being pressured in was they were being persecuted for believing that Jesus was the Son, or Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man. They were under great persecution. If they believed he was the Messiah, they were also being persuaded to not believe he was the Messiah. So it was this combination of persuasion and persecution that was pressuring the Jewish people to reject Jesus, resulting in remaining with the law of Moses or returning to the law of Moses. Now, this pressure and persecution started during the life of Jesus. So we're going to look back on the persuasion that people were under and the persecution that people were under if they, the Jewish people, believed Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of Man, or the Son of God. So we're going to start in John 7:13, where John writes about the persecution that would happen if Jewish people believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Of course, this is during the life of Jesus, during his time on earth. So John writes in John 7:13, and he says, "Yet no one would speak publicly about him, about Jesus, and they wouldn't speak publicly about Jesus being the Son, the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man." And it says, and John says, and here's the reason why people wouldn't publicly say that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the Christ. Yet no one would speak publicly about Jesus being the Messiah, the Christ, for fear of the Jews. Fear of the Jews is fear-based religious intimidation by the religious leaders of Jesus's day. They were intimidating the people that if you believe Jesus is the Messiah, if you believe Jesus is the Christ, then we're going to kick you out of the synagogue. This fear-based religious intimidation was also fear-based religious control by the religious leaders, by the leaders of the synagogues, by the Pharisees, by the teachers of the law. And so they would intimidate the people by saying, if you believe that Jesus is the Messiah, we're going to remove you from the synagogue. Now, for a Jewish person to be removed from the synagogue would mean they could lose their job, they could lose their position in the community, they could lose social friends. It would be difficult for them to have money to buy food. I mean, it was a really difficult situation that a person would be in Jewish time if they were removed or kicked out of the synagogue. And so if people came to faith in Jesus, if they believed that Jesus was the Messiah or the Christ during the life of Jesus on earth, then they would be kicked out of the synagogues. Now remember, Jesus was kicked out of his own synagogue. Remember in Luke chapter 4, Jesus spoke at his hometown synagogue. And after speaking, the people tried to throw Jesus off a cliff. Now think about this. Jesus knew all the people in his synagogue. I mean, Jesus had been there since he was a young person. He was very familiar with the people. They knew him. They knew Mary. They knew Joseph. They even said after Jesus spoke, isn't this Mary and Joseph's son? And even after speaking, where Jesus said, I am the Messiah, I am the Christ, they tried to kill Jesus. And in doing that, they're saying, we don't want you in our synagogue. We want you dead. And so the same intimidation was happening by those who believed that Jesus was the Messiah in whatever synagogue they belonged to. The moment it was known publicly that someone believed Jesus was the Messiah, they were removed from the synagogue. And that was not a good place to be. So it was intimidation and control going on by these religious leaders. Now, those who verbally declared their belief in Jesus, they were kicked out of the synagogues. John writes about this in John chapter 9, verse 22, as well as John chapter 12, verse 42. John 9:22 says, that's the blind person that Jesus healed. His parents said this being, hey, you go ask our son who healed you, because the parents knew if they said, hey, Jesus healed my son, we believe he's the Messiah, well, then they would be kicked out of the synagogues as well. So John 9:22 says, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. The Jews were very powerful religious leaders operating in fear-based intimidation. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already determined that anyone who confessed or acknowledged Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah, as the Son, would be put out of the synagogue. So that was a major issue going on during the life of Jesus. John 12:42, John writes this, yet at the same time, many, even among the leaders, believed in him, or believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of God, the Son of Man. But because of the Pharisees, the religious intimidators of the day, they would not openly acknowledge or openly confess or publicly confess their faith in Jesus as the Messiah for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. So being kicked out of the synagogue, removed from the synagogue, would put someone in a very desperate situation, the person who was removed as well as their family. So we're looking at the situation in AD 65 when the writer wrote his letter to the Hebrews. All right. And we're going to see how what was going on during the life of Jesus continued during the time after Jesus ascended into heaven and was the focus of what the writer of Hebrews was writing about in parts of Hebrews. So we're looking at the situation in AD 65 when the Jewish people, because of persuasion and persecution, were under tremendous pressure to reject Jesus as the Son and to reject the New Testament of grace that he established in his blood. And if they rejected Jesus, then they would go back to the law of Moses, which would please the intimidators. They would go back to the law of Moses, which would make the religious leaders who were operating in fearful control and in fearful intimidation, it would make them happy for the Jewish people to reject Jesus and return to Moses. That's exactly what's going on in the book of Hebrews. Now, this persuasion and persecution started during the earthly life of Jesus. And Jesus says prior to his crucifixion that the persuasion and persecution that started during his earthly life would continue after his ascension. And he writes or he speaks about this in John 15, 18 through 25, when he's with his disciples in the upper room just prior to his arrest, just prior to his crucifixion. And Jesus says this, if the world hates you. Now he's talking about the religious world of the Pharisees. He's talking about the religious system of the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the teachers of the law. And we'll see that momentarily. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. Remember, Luke chapter 4, Jesus was hated by his hometown synagogue to the point where they wanted to throw him off the cliff. All right, if the religious world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. The religious world, the world of the Judaizers, the world of the Jewish leaders is what it's referring to here. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they, the religious world, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, if they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they obeyed my teaching that I'm the Messiah, I'm the Christ, that's the first teaching we see in Luke chapter 4, Jesus teaching in the synagogue that he is the Messiah, he is the Christ. So if they obeyed my teaching that I'm the Messiah, I'm the Christ who's establishing the new covenant or the New Testament in my blood, they will also obey your teachings that I'm the Messiah, I'm the Christ who's established the new covenant in my blood. They, the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law who claim to know God the Father, they will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. Now they claimed to know God, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the Jewish leaders. They claim to know God. They claim to know God as Father. But Jesus, if you'll read when you get some time, John chapter 8 through John chapter 12, and you see an ongoing conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and they're claiming to know God. But what Jesus is saying in John 8 through 12 is, if you really knew God the Father, then you would accept me as the Son. But because you reject me as the Son, you really don't know God the Father. All right. That's John chapter 8 through chapter 12. Verse 22. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. Now, the sin it's referring to here is the sin of unbelief in Jesus as the Christ. It's the sin of blasphemy, the unpardonable sin that the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders were committing, because what they were doing, Jesus was doing miracles. And the miracles that Jesus was doing, the miracles that Jesus were doing, that he was doing, validated the fact that he was the Messiah, gave credibility to the fact that he was the Christ. And Jesus doing these miracles in front of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and the Jewish leaders is what made them guilty of sin. It made them guilty of unbelief, because in rejecting the miracles that Jesus did and saying that the miracles that he's doing are satanic, they're done by demons, they're done by Satan, they're done by Beelzebub, then they're saying Jesus is not the Messiah, Jesus is not the Christ. That was the unpardonable sin that the Jewish people committed during the time of Jesus on earth, unbelief in Jesus as the Christ. So chapter 15, verse 22, if I had not come and spoken to them, they, the Jewish leaders, would not be guilty of sin, unbelief in Jesus as the Christ. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Verse 23, whoever hates me hates my Father as well. Verse 24, if I had done among them the works, if I had not done among them the works no one else did, that's his miracles. He did miracles among the Jewish leaders. If I had not done among them the works no one else did to prove that he was the Messiah, to prove that he was the Christ, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen the miracles that I've done. They've seen me testify that I'm the Messiah and I'm the Christ, yet they've hated me, and they've hated both me and my Father, which they would have said, no, we hate you and we don't think you're of the Father. We love the Father. And Jesus said, no, you don't know the Father, because if you knew the Father, then you would accept me as the Father's son. That's the conversation between John 8 and John 12. And then verse 25, but this is to fulfill, this is what Jesus said, but this is to fulfill what was written in their law being the religious leaders of Judaism. They hated me without reason. So when we start up in John 15, 18 through 25, he says, if the world hates you, and he defines exactly who the world is. The world is the religious leaders of Judaism, the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. And that's important to keep in mind for us to understand the book of Hebrews. So in the verses that we just read, Jesus is describing the future persecution Jewish people would experience from their own leaders in their own communities, in their own synagogues, if they turned away from Judaism to Jesus, if they turned away from Moses to Jesus, if they turned away from the Old Testament of law to the New Testament of grace. And Jesus continues this in John 16, 1 through 4. And he says this to his disciples. All this I have told you, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. All this I have told you, okay, also all this, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you for believing in me. They being the religious leaders of Judaism. All this I have told you, talking to the disciples, so that you will not fall away from the truth that Jesus is the Son, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ. And they would not fall away from the New Testament of grace that he established in his blood. Now, notice what verse 2 says. So we'll start with verse 1 again of John 16. All this I have told you so that you will not fall away. Verse 2, they will put you out of the synagogue. Remember that. They will put you out of the synagogue. And that's exactly what happened to Jesus in Luke 4. He was removed from the synagogue and they attempted to take his life, because he claimed that he was the Messiah. And so that anybody else who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, they would be kicked out of the synagogue as well. So what Jesus is doing is he's foreshadowing, after he ascends into heaven, that the persecution that began during his life on earth would continue and would ramp up toward those who believed he was the Messiah. So verse 2, they will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. Now, that's a reference to who we now know as the Apostle Paul, who was known as Saul, who was giving permission for Stephen to be stoned to death. And then Paul was going to Damascus to put anyone into prison and to beat people who believed Jesus was the Messiah. And the entire time Paul was doing it, he thought he was doing a service to God, because in the mind of Paul, Jesus was a false Messiah. He was a false Christ. And he was blaspheming against the temple and against the Jewish nation and against the Jewish people. And in Paul's mind, this Jesus guy needs to be put to death. And I'm doing this on behalf of God. I'm carrying out a service God would have me to carry out. So that's referencing Paul and others who were like Paul, which took place during the early chapters of Acts. So they will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming, and if you want to write in there, the beginning of the beginning of Acts probably 1 through really most of Acts records persecution against believers in Jesus by the religious leaders of the day. Paul, who was once persecuting people, became persecuted after he became a believer in Jesus. So he's talking really about what happened during the book of Acts. Jesus is. They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they're offering a service to God. They will do such things because they have not known the Father or me, though they claim to know the Father. Verse 4, I've told you this, about this coming persecution for believing Jesus is the Son, and the persecution for the New Testament of grace that Jesus established in his blood. He said, I've told you this so that when their time comes, their time being those who are persecuting people for believing Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the Christ, the religious leaders doing the persecution, so that when their time, the religious leaders persecuting other Jewish people for coming to faith in Jesus and believing in Jesus as the Christ, so that when their time comes, you will remember that I warn you about the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the Jewish leaders, the synagogue rulers who are going to kick people out of the synagogue and who are going to kill people for believing in Jesus as the Christ. All right. I did not tell you this about this coming persecution from the beginning, that time when I was with you from the beginning, because I was with you. But now I'm going to him who sent me, the ascension. I'm going to the Father. And after I go to the Father, persecution's going to break out. Now we have to keep this in mind if we're going to understand the book of Hebrews, because the book of Hebrews was written in AD 65. It wasn't written to us living in 2021. It was written to a real group of people living in AD 65 about persecution that Jesus is referring to here. We're going to look at that momentarily. So we see in these verses, Jesus describing the future persecution of those who believed in him as the Son, as the Christ. Remember the writer of Hebrews, chapter 1 of Hebrews, Jesus is the Son of God. Chapter 2, Jesus is the Son of Man. All right. So we see these verses describing Jesus, or we see these verses that Jesus is describing the future persecution of those who believed in him as the Son, the Christ, and who abandoned the old covenant of law and accepted the new covenant of grace. Persecution came to those who accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and then who abandoned the old covenant of law and accepted the new covenant of grace. All right. In Acts, we see the persecution that Jesus referred to in John 15 and 16. We see this persecution beginning to break out. Look in Acts 4, 1 through 3. The priest, that's the Jewish priest over the temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish priest, the priest and the captain of the temple guard, it's a Jewish temple, the priest and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to Peter. Sadducees were religious leaders as well, Jewish religious leaders. The priest and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to Peter and John while they were speaking to the people. They were greatly disturbed, that's the Jewish leaders, were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people, proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. They seized Peter and John, and because it was evening, they put them in jail until the next day. So we see persecution there. Acts 15, 17 through 42, the apostles of Jesus were put in what's called public jail. They were ordered to be flogged by the religious leaders of Israel. The leaders made up what is called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was basically the Supreme Court for Israel. They ruled on matters of the law of Moses. They heard cases, and then they made decisions. It was 70 men who made up the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin ordered that the apostles of Jesus be put in public jail to publicly shame them, to try to teach others a lesson who would look at them and say, unless you want to be put in public jail too, you guys need to knock off this Jesus is the Messiah belief that you have. You need to reject Jesus as the Messiah, reject him as the Christ, or you too are going to end up in public jail. They're trying to shame people. Intimidation again. Intimidation, religious control, religious intimidation. We also see in Acts 6 through 7 that Stephen was opposed by the leaders of the synagogue of the freemen, and was eventually stoned to death by members of the Sanhedrin. And remember, Paul was one of the leaders of the Sanhedrin who was given his permission for Stephen to be stoned to death. You can read about that in Acts 6 and 7. So Stephen was stoned to death, and this great persecution broke out against those who believed that Jesus was the Christ, those who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. It's the persecution that Jesus talked about in John 15 and John 16. So we see in Acts 8, 1 through 2, these words. On that day, when Stephen was stoned to death, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, the believers in Jesus. And all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul, who we now know as Paul, began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. So there was a tremendous amount of persecution going on among the Jewish people by the Jewish leaders for anyone who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, anyone who believed that Jesus was the Christ. Paul, in sharing his testimony about coming to faith in Jesus, shares his testimony in Acts 22:4. So I want us to read Acts 22:4 and verse 19, which are just small clips of Paul's testimony. He says, I persecuted this way even to the death, detaining both men and women and throwing them into prison. In one synagogue after another, I imprisoned and beat those who believed. Now that takes us back up to John chapter 16, where Jesus said, believers who come, those who come to believe in me as the Messiah, they're going to be kicked out and removed from their synagogues. And it's happening. Everything Jesus says begins to happen in the book of Acts. This terrible persecution that's happening among those who came to faith in Jesus. And here's Paul, or Saul at this time. He's dragging both men and women out, persecuting some to their deaths, imprisoning these believers in Jesus as the Christ, beating them. So tremendous persecution. So in Acts, we see the future persecution that Jesus described in John 15 and 16. It's become reality in the book of Acts. What he foreshadowed in John 15 and 16 becomes reality in the book of Acts. Now, in Hebrews, the writer refers to this persecution in the book of Acts that took place between AD 33 and AD 65. All right. And we see this description by the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 10, 32 through 39. This is the International Standard Version, Hebrews 10, 32 through 39. But you, that's those being pressured to abandon Jesus because of the persuasion and persecution that they're under. They're being persuaded to not believe Jesus is the Christ. They're being persuaded not to believe he's the Son of God, the Son of Man, the Messiah, through very clever teachers seeking to prove that Jesus is not the Messiah. He's not the Christ. But you, those who are being pressured to abandon Jesus because of persuasion and persecution, intimidation. Persuasion would be instruction. Somebody's instructing them through teaching, seeking to convince them Jesus isn't the Messiah. Others through persecution being intimidation. So through instruction and intimidation, those who were receiving this letter, we now know as the letter to the Hebrews, were seeking to be pressured and persuaded to abandon Jesus as the Messiah. Okay. But you must continue to remember those early days. Well, what early days? Well, that would be AD 33, which is when Jesus ascended into heaven. So the early days would have been AD 33 through the book of Acts, or not through the book of Acts, but the early days would have happened during the book of Acts, all the persecution that we just read about AD 33 on, which is recorded in the book of Acts. That's the early days. But you must continue to remember those early days, how after you were enlightened, and then the question is, well, enlightened to what? Enlightened to Jesus being the Christ, enlightened to the fact that Jesus has established a new covenant, a new testament in his blood. Remember, those who received the letter to the Hebrews, who received this letter, were in danger of drifting away from Hebrews chapter 1, Jesus is the Son of God. They were in danger of drifting away from Hebrews chapter 2, Jesus is the Son of Man. They were in danger of ignoring what people had told them about Jesus and thus ignoring such a great salvation. They were about to say, you know what? I don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. I don't believe Jesus is the Christ. In the early days, yeah, I thought he was. But now these teachers are convincing me. These instructors are convincing me. These intimidators are controlling me. And I'm about to abandon Jesus as the Messiah. I'm about to reject him as the Christ. I'm about to reject his blood. And I'm going back to the law of Moses. I'm going back to the temple in Jerusalem. I'm going back to the priest. I'm going back to sacrificing animals. That's what's happening in Hebrews. But you must continue to remember those early days, how after you were enlightened, you endured a hard and painful struggle. All right, that's the book of Acts. The persecution that broke out against them, and people scattered because of the persecution that started with the stoning of Stephen. You endured a hard and painful struggle. At times, you were made a public spectacle by means of insults and persecutions. Remember, the apostles were put into public jail. And that was why, to make a public spectacle out of them, to insult them, to shame them. And others were put in public jail as well. At times, you were made a public spectacle by means of insults and persecutions, while at other times you associated with people who were treated this way. Verse 34 of Hebrews 10. For you sympathize with the prisoners. Now, who was putting them in prison? Paul and many others were dragging them out of their synagogues, were beating them, were putting them into prison. For you sympathize with the prisoners and cheerfully submitted to the violent seizure of your property. So they were being removed from the synagogues. They were being removed from their homes. Paul writes about this. He was one of the ones doing this. And when they were removed from their homes, their belongings were taken as well. I mean, these people were being persecuted for simply believing that Jesus was the Messiah. For you sympathize with the prisoners and you cheerfully submitted to the violent seizure of your property because you know that you have a better and more permanent possession. That's eternal life in Christ. 35. So don't lose your confidence. They were confident at one time that Jesus was the Messiah. They were confident that Jesus was the Christ. They were confident in the new covenant that he had established in his blood. But now, because of instruction and intimidation, because of persuasion and persecution, they're about to throw away their confidence. So don't lose your confidence to what you previously were enlightened to about Jesus, since it holds a great reward for you. For you need endurance, meaning you need to continue to believe that Jesus is the Christ, continue to believe in this new covenant that he's established in his blood in the face of this persecution that you're undergoing, in the face of this persuasion and this instruction and this intimidation. Don't let them convince you that Jesus is not the Messiah. Don't let them convince you that Jesus isn't the Christ. Don't ignore what others told you about Jesus. That's Hebrews chapter 2, the first maybe 4 verses. Don't ignore what you heard from those who personally saw Jesus and witnessed Jesus and his miracles and his resurrection. That's who you need to listen to. Listen to them and not to these who are trying to intimidate you and who are instructing you that Jesus isn't the Messiah. For you need endurance. So after you have done God's will, now what's the will of God? It's to believe. Jesus talked about that in the book of John. What's the will of God? The will of God is that we believe. So that after you have done God's will, belief, faith, you can receive what he has promised. All right. So in the next set of verses that we're going to look at, the writer of Hebrews quotes from Jewish scripture to encourage the Jewish people to live by faith in Jesus when facing pressure to return to the law of Moses. All right, we've read Hebrews 10:32 through 36. We're going to pick up now in Hebrews 10:37 through 39. Verse 37, for in a little while, the one who is coming will return. That's Jesus. The writer of Hebrews is encouraging the people to endure what they're going through. Don't go back to Judaism. Don't go back to Moses. Don't go back to the law. Don't go back to the blood of animals. Don't go back to the temple. Because in a little while, the one who is coming will return and he will not delay. The writer seeking to get their focus on the return of Jesus. Focus on Jesus. He's going to return. He is the Messiah. He is the Christ. Verse 37, for in a very little while, the one who is coming will return. He will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith. All right, that's the thought. He's the writer of Hebrews. This is one of the main themes of Hebrews. It's faith in Jesus as the Messiah. It's faith in Jesus as the Son of God, Hebrews 1, the Son of Man, Hebrews 2. And it's a faith that rests in the new covenant of grace and ceases to live according to the old covenant or the Old Testament of law. Okay. For in a very little while, the one who is coming will return. He will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith. It's by faith we are made righteous, not the law of Moses. That's the idea here. You are not made righteous by living according to the law of Moses. You are righteous because of faith in Jesus. All right. Verse 38, but my righteous one will live by faith in Jesus. And if he turns back to Judaism, to Moses, to the law, my soul will take no pleasure in him. What gives God pleasure is when a person rest in the new covenant of grace. That's what gives God joy. It gives God joy to see us resting in the fact that we're completely forgiven, that we're completely righteous. We're resting. We're not trying to earn anything. We're not trying to work for anything. We're not trying to merit anything with him through any kind of religious system or any kind of religious law. It's simply faith in Jesus. And that's why religion has such a difficult time with grace, because grace is everything God did for us in Christ, leaving us nothing to do. And by faith, we rest in everything that he's done for us. We're righteous, we're forgiven, we're in fellowship, we're at peace with God, we're under no condemnation. For in a very little while, the one who is coming will return. He will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith. If he turns back to the law, to Moses, to Judaism, my soul will take no pleasure in him. It doesn't give God any pleasure to see somebody trying to merit what he's given us for free, trying to earn what he's giving us for free. Verse 39, now we do not belong to those who turn back to Judaism, to Moses, to the law, and are destroyed in judgment, but we belong to those who have faith in Jesus and who are saved by his blood. That's the book of Hebrews. We're sanctified, we're forgiven through the blood of Christ. And those who have faith in Jesus, they won't go back to Judaism. They won't go back to the law. They won't go back to Moses, because their faith is rooted in the work of Jesus. So as we move out of Hebrews chapter 10 and into Hebrews chapter 11, the writer expounds on faith. And he's explaining that faith is not a foreign, strange concept to the Jewish people, that faith is a part of the Jewish heritage. So Hebrews 11 flows right out of Hebrews 10. And if we don't make those connections, then Hebrews 11 is just going to be an isolated chapter in Hebrews that has absolutely no connection to Hebrews 1 through 10 and 12 and beyond, which is what happens with most pastors. They'll preach out of Hebrews 11 and they'll preach a lot of messages on faith. But Hebrews 11 is just an illustration by the writer to try to convince the Jewish people he's writing to that this faith that he's calling them to this resting in the finished work of the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man, resting by faith. Faith is not strange to their Jewish heritage. And he gives a whole chapter, which is chapter 11, which Hebrews wasn't written in chapter and verses, but he spends what we've isolated as Hebrews 11, explaining that faith is not any kind of foreign, strange concept, that faith is a part of the Jewish heritage. Therefore, the writer saying, place your faith in Jesus, that shouldn't be strange to them. Faith shouldn't be a strange concept. And then coming out of Hebrews 11, he moves into Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. Now, Hebrews 12, 1 through 3 is preached on by a lot of preachers. If a preacher is going to preach on Hebrews, it's probably going to be out of Hebrews 11 or Hebrews 12, 1 through 2, typically. But most of the sermons we hear on Hebrews 11 and 12, 1 through 2 are disconnected from the larger reasoning and the larger logic and the larger purpose for which the writer is writing the book of Hebrews. So what I want us to do in Hebrews 12, 1 through 3 is understand these verses within their context, because it's the context that gives us the full meaning and has a really tremendous impact on our lives when we understand these verses in context. So Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. Therefore, referring back to Hebrews 11, which flowed out of Hebrews 10, this issue of faith. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, the witnesses are those who live by faith as seen in the Jewish scriptures. Okay, Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us, the Jewish people, throw off everything that hinders. Now, what would that be in the book of Hebrews? Everything that hinders in the book of Hebrews is the law of Moses. It's the works of the law. It's the baptisms and the offerings and the sacrifices under the Levitical system that we see in Leviticus, that we see in Deuteronomy, that we see in Exodus. Everything associated with the temple. I mean, can you imagine the weight of having to live according to the law? That would hinder someone's relationship with God, trying to fulfill the law. So what the writer is doing, he says, since there's a group that went before you who live by faith, throw off works is what he's saying. Throw off trying to merit something with God. Throw off trying to obtain something with God. Throw that off. It'll hinder you in your relationship with God, and live by faith. So let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Now, most pastors will say, hey, whatever's hindering your relationship with God, you need to get rid of it. Whatever sin that you're struggling with, you need to get rid of it. That's not the context here. It's not even remotely the context. Let us, the Jewish people, throw off the law of Moses and the sin of unbelief in Jesus that so easily entangles. That's the sin of Hebrews. If you want to write out Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12, the writer of Hebrews says he was concerned that there were Jewish people who were going to continue to have a sinful, unbelieving heart in Jesus as the Messiah. All right. So the sin of Hebrews is unbelief in Jesus as the Christ. It's the same sin the Jewish leaders committed in John 8 through 12. The rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. It's the unpardonable sin. It's the sin that so easily entangles. Why? Because the flesh of humanity wants to work. The flesh of it's easy to get entangled in works. It's easy to get tangled in a works system, a religious system, a merit system with God, because it feels good to the flesh. I'm doing something to merit forgiveness. I'm doing something to merit fellowship. I'm doing something to merit righteousness. I'm doing something to merit eternal life. And it's so easy to get entangled into that religious system, especially when it's being communicated to us by religious leaders. So the leaders or the writer of the Pharisee is saying, listen, throw off works, throw off the works of the law of Moses because it hinders you, and the sin of unbelief in Jesus because it hinders you. And let us run with perseverance. All right, perseverance in the face of persuasion and persecution. Here's what he's saying. Continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Continue to believe that Jesus is the Christ. Persevere through the persecution. Persevere through the persuasion. Persevere through the intimidation. Persevere through the instructions of religious leaders seeking to convince you Jesus is not the Son of God and he's not the Son of Man, and that his blood does not cleanse from all sin. All right. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Now, what would have that been? It would have been the writer loves, to use here sports analogies. That's why I possibly think Paul wrote Hebrews. Paul, 75% of his analogies and illustrations were sports related. And he used this word race several times in his letters. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Now, what would that have been in context with those receiving this letter? It would have been belief in Jesus as the Christ and belief in the New Testament of grace that he established in his blood, which brought complete forgiveness. The race marked out for them was not the law of Moses. The race marked out for them was the good news of the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. And what the writer is saying is persevere in those truths when people are trying to push you away from them. And the way they would persevere is he goes into verse 2. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, on his endurance, on the persecution that he received from religious leaders. Look at the endurance of Jesus in the face of persecution. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. See, the Jewish scriptures said that a Messiah was coming. The Jewish scriptures said the Christ was coming, the Son of God, the Son of Man was coming. And Jesus is that one. He's the one who fulfilled the faith of the Jewish people. He's the one who fulfilled what the Jewish scriptures were promising would come. So he's telling them, here's how you throw off everything that hinders. Here's how you throw off the law. Here's how you throw off the sin of unbelief that so easily entangles. Here's how you run with perseverance, the race marked out for you. Fix your eyes on Jesus, not Moses. That's what he's saying here. That's what he's saying in Hebrews 3, 1-6. Jesus is greater than Moses. Fix your thoughts on him. He's saying the same thing here. Verse 2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, on his endurance in the face of persecution, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. He provided purification for sins through the cross. That's Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1-3. And after Jesus provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty, Hebrews 1:3. So the writer of Hebrews in these verses is calling them to rest in Jesus. Jesus sat down, you sit down. Don't get caught up in the works of the law. Sit down in the work of grace is what he's saying. And though you're persecuted, and though you're intimidated, and though you're seeking to be persuaded to abandon Jesus as the Christ and abandon the new covenant of grace, keep your eyes on Jesus in the middle of this intimidation and in the middle of this instruction, in the middle of this persuasion and in the middle of this persecution. Fix your eyes on Jesus and what he endured at the cross. And then look at verse 3 with all this in context. Consider Jesus, who endured such opposition from sinners. Now, who was that? Remember back in John chapter 15, John chapter 16? The sinful opposition to Jesus was the leaders of Judaism, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. That they opposed Jesus to the point of calling for his crucifixion and arranging for his arrest. The same persecution is now happening to the believers in AD 65. And the writer is saying, hey, Jewish people, look at Jesus. He endured such opposition from sinners. You look at Jesus, you learn from Jesus so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Now, why would they grow weary and lose heart? Because they were undergoing opposition as well. They were going under opposition from those who were seeking to persuade them that Jesus wasn't the Christ, for the persecution for believing he was the Christ. Keep your eyes on Jesus in this opposition that you're facing in AD 65 from the sinful religious leaders of the day, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart because of those who oppose and persecute you. In your struggle against sin, this isn't talking about the personal sin a believer may struggle with. In your struggle against the opposition of sinners, against the sinful ones who are opposing you, that was their struggle. They were struggling against the adversaries of Jesus, those who were persecuting them and those who were persuading them and those who were intimidating them. That was their struggle against sinful opposition. In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted those opposing you to the point of shedding your blood, as did Jesus on the cross. So at this point in time, those who were receiving this letter were under tremendous persecution, but not to the point of death. Jesus's persecution went to the point of shedding his own blood when they nailed him to a cross. So he's encouraging them to say, keep your eyes on Jesus and what he endured on the cross, so that when people come against you for what you believe about Jesus and what he did for you on the cross, keep your eyes on him so that you're not swayed by their persecution. You're not swayed by their persuasion. You're not swayed by their intimidation. If they want to kick you out of the group, let them kick you out of the group. Keep your eyes on Jesus. And that's for us as well today. When we believe in this New Testament of grace that Jesus has established for us in his blood, when we choose to rest in the finality of forgiveness, when we choose to throw off the works of the law, the works of the religious system, or the works of the denomination, when we no longer allow ourselves to be entangled in the sin of unbelief that Jesus didn't do it all, there's some things I've got to contribute. When we're no longer entangled in a system of works, and we're living by grace, by faith in what Christ did for us, complete forgiveness, complete righteousness, 24 hours, 7 days a week fellowship with God, at peace with God, opposition will come against us. There will be those who will try to persuade us to no longer walk according to the new covenant of grace, the New Testament of grace. There will be some who maybe will persecute us to a certain degree, slander us, shame us, try to talk about us, seek to ruin our reputation. There will be some who relate to us in an intimidation. I had somebody try to intimidate me, 6 months ago or so. Brad, what you're teaching is dangerous to people. This religious leader trying to intimidate me. But I had to stand up for the gospel. I had to stand up for grace. I had to stand up and stand firm in what Jesus had done for me and continue to teach to others this good news of the gospel. Some of y'all who are listening to this on a podcast or who are watching on a video, you know what it's like to go through some persecution for believing in Jesus. You know what it's like to be intimidated for believing in the new covenant of grace. And in this intimidation, you're still standing up to the denominational beliefs, so to speak. And you're not going to allow yourself to be entangled in the denominational beliefs or the religious system that you were once a part of. And you're standing strong and firm in the gospel of grace, which is what Paul encouraged the Galatians to do in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. So I hope this gives us some insight into the book of Hebrews, because unless we have this insight into the struggle that was happening among the readers of this letter, the struggle that came from the persecution they were experiencing, the struggle that came from the intimidation they were experiencing, and the persuasion that they were experiencing, so that now we can really get into the mind of the writer, into the heart of the writer as he writes to these Jewish people in the book of Hebrews. All right, well, next week in our next study, we're going to continue this study on Hebrews and understanding this historical situation, the awareness of this historical situation to the original Jewish readers and the persecution and persuasion they were facing. It's going to help us understand more fully Hebrews 3, 1 through 6, so that when we hear a pastor teach on it, we understand the context. So we're not going to misapply these verses in a way that they were never meant to be applied. I hope understanding this historical situation will allow us to interpret Hebrews more accurately and therefore then apply it to our lives more accurately.